Welcome to Richplanet TV. I'm Richard D. Hall. On last week's show, I featured some of the research of Carl James, author of Science Fiction and the Hidden Global Agenda. I would describe his book thus. It is a belief held by many that visible governments and other visible establishment ruling bodies are not the real decision makers on this planet. The real governors of the earth prefer to remain hidden from public view and operate through intermediaries, world governments being one of these intermediaries. Another intermediary one might consider being used by the power elite would be the manufacturers of huge blockbuster movies such as Hollywood film companies and producers. The genre of science fiction is one we are all familiar with. But do we really understand why certain science fiction ideas have been promoted to the masses? Today's guest would assert that the global agenda of those who really control this planet have used science fiction for a range of perception management purposes. He joined me last week to talk about Stanley Kubrick, and he joins me again today to talk about Gene Roddenberry, the creator of Star Trek. Kirk to Bridge. Welcome back, Carl James.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me.
Now then, we're on dangerous territory of this becoming quite a nerdy sort of show today. But just to talk more generally about science fiction, because I read in your book that you felt that the machine that makes science fiction seems to have changed fairly recently, in that you think it's took a different direction in the way it's trying to steer people. Just tell us about that first.
I think principally post 9/11, science fiction is rapidly disappearing. It's being sort of shifted more towards sort of fantasy and paranormal, and we get a lot of sort of witchcraft and that sort of supernatural powers and bloodletting ritual. I mean, certainly if you look at things that get passed as science fiction, which aren't, these things sort of vampirism and werewolves and zombies, and I mean, they call it science fiction, but it isn't. And,
right.
And the traditional sense of science fiction sort of being set in space and exploration and extraterrestrials and planets is very much sort of gone. I mean, there are a few examples in Hollywood films. There's one or two television series like Doctor Who maybe, but...
So do you have a feeling for why that might be? Why it's changed its focus? Or why the global elite have demanded that the focus change?
I kind of see science fiction in a way as being like a sort of a new religion. It kind of... As the decades have gone by and religion doesn't have its sway on people as it perhaps used to have, they've had to replace it with all kinds of sort of new age sort of symbolism and things like that. And certainly
Premier League football.
Well, yeah, and dancing on shite.
Yeah, that's the one. Yeah. All right.
I think it serves its purpose as that anyway. Yeah.
And another question, which I don't necessarily expect you to answer, Carl, but I'm going to ask you anyway. The title of your book is. It's about the agenda or the hidden agenda of the global elite. What do you think the agenda is then of this hidden group?
I think it's essentially...
It's not an easy question.
No, it's not. I mean, certainly in the book I lay it out in several factors. I think there's two overarching parts to it, and it's difficult to sort of label one particular group, or people talk about the Illuminati and all that kind of thing, but I think it's far more complex than that. I think there's lots. I think essentially they all sing from the same song sheet, but they've got different approaches to it, and I think it's two parts. Essentially, one is control of the masses, perceptions of the masses, and the other half of it, I would certainly say, is the control of our perceptions of reality. So you've got on a day-to-day basis sort of our perception of the world around us, and then the cover up of the true reality, and that would tie into things like consciousness and energy, and spinning off from that you've got things like free energy as well and things like that. So
I would
it's muddying that up, so we can't sort of see it for what it really is.
I would concur on those two things: the cover up of certain information, and that might not necessarily mean keeping it hidden. It might mean spinning it in a ridiculous fashion. So the cover-up is more complex than just not letting people see things.
But muddying things is also hiding things, but just in a different way. It's just, can't see the wood for the trees, effectively.
Yeah, so, and I think the other aspect is I use the word fracture society, to break them down so that they will follow shite. and not really think for themselves.
I mean, going back to science fiction, for example, you get somebody like Aldous Huxley who talks about constant distraction. I think the world we live in is very much sort of this amalgamation of, on one side of it, you've got Orwell's dictatorial 1984, and then you've got Huxley's Brave New World, where everyone's totally hepped up on Soma, you know, and they're not. They're just everyone's just living for the next great distraction, effectively, and you can see that happening in the world today now.
Yeah, absolutely. And as you say, there's lots of different methods. I mean, I in my lectures have spoken about how the family is targeted, not by the visible government, but in a whole lot of different identifying differences, and then making the different sections war with each other, therefore dumb them down so that they're chasing their tails and they're not really thinking about what's going on.
No.
All right, well, how does that link into Star Trek? Let's, because Gene Roddenberry is the person who was accredited with creating Star Trek.
Effectively, yeah. I mean, there were other people involved in it, but largely he's the man that they name as being it.
So before we go on to him, we're going to talk about this character, Andrea Paharic.
Yeah.
Just
Paharic, some people call him.
Yeah. Just tell us about him.
Yeah, so I mean, effectively in the late 1940s, he qualified as a doctor and neurologist at Northwestern University, 1947, under a US Army training scheme. And he established in 1948 this organisation called the Round Table Foundation of Electrobiology in Glen Cove in Maine. It was to study ESP and psychic phenomena and that sort of thing. So, 1952, he meets this Indian mystic chap called Dr. D.G. Vinod, and he channels these things called the 9 principles and forces in the presence of Paharic, and this is tied in later. This is the group called Lab 9, and the idea of the 9 is communication with what some people say are extraterrestrial, some people say extra-dimensional entities, but there's much more to it than that, because if you look at this organisation and what's going on around it, Paharic is, I mean, first of all, you look at the people involved with it. You've got the largest financial contributor of it is Henry Wallace, former US Vice President, responsible for putting the Great Seal on the $1 bill, you know, the Masonic seal. Get Barbara Brompham from the Brompham, a Canadian elite family. Alice Bovary, who's with the Astor family, daughter of the founder of the Astoria Hotel in New York. Marcella Miller DuPont, the elite DuPont and Miller families. Henry Belk, who's a multimillionaire involved with the Human Potential Fund, which some people now believe is connected to like a conduit for the CIA. Arthur M. Young, who designed the Model 30 Bell helicopter. Ruth Forbes Payne of the Payne family. And also later on you get this chap, Sir John Whitmore as well, who's a very famous British racing driver in the 60s. That kind of ties into Gene Roddenberry shortly.
So have all of those people that you just mentioned there spoken about Lab 9 at some point?
Yeah. And or have been referred to in association with it.
Right. And Lab 9 was...
principally the Round Table Foundation, but there is some spillover of those people into Lab 9, because Lab 9 was effectively founded in like 1971, so it was 20 years after the Round Table Foundation.
And Lab 9 was the name of a group of extraterrestrials that they were supposedly in telepathic contact with, no?
Yeah, Lab 9 was the name of the organisation that was studying the phenomenon.
Right.
But the 9 and the 9 principal forces was effectively these entities that were conveying it.
And was that just, was Lab 9 purely about the fact that they were allegedly getting messages from ETs, or was it just studying psychic phenomena?
No, I mean a lot of it was about studying the 9, but equally as much it was about studying psychic phenomenon, psychic abilities, that sort of thing. But also you've got the US military and the CIA heavily involved in it. I mean, you have to look at Paharic's credentials himself. He reported to the Pentagon. He wrote this paper for them called Possible Usefulness of Extrasensory Perception in Psychological Warfare, 1952. He worked for this, presented that paper on behalf of this group called the Essentia Research Group, who were studying psychic abilities for the Pentagon, NASA, the Atomic Energy Commission. He reported his findings to the Army Chief of Psychological Warfare. And there's numerous accounts, people that were associated with him coming forward and saying He worked for the CIA, he worked for the US military, he was involved in MK Ultra. February 1953, he's recruited into the Army Chemical Centre in Edgewood. If you do any research on that, you're looking at sort of chemical and psychological warfare for the CIA conducting their MK Ultra experiments there at the same time as he's doing his work there.
Let me just put a sort of a devil's advocate type question. The mainstream view on all of that, I don't think it's denied that the CIA were looking at psychic phenomenon and out-of-body type phenomenon, remote viewing and all that kind of stuff in the 60s and 70s and maybe after that. But I would say the prevailing mainstream view is that it went nowhere. They couldn't really find anything to it, and it was interesting at the time. What's your view on where it went?
Yeah, it's very difficult to sort of evidentially prove where it went, but certainly if you look at the connections between the CIA and the military and the psychic research itself was going on till well into the mid-1990s. It just kept changing name and that. And certainly the CIA shifted a lot of their research over to sort of psychotronic implants and things like that, and the involvement of groups like DARPA and that. So it shifted around, and I think the MK Ultra thing, because it's so exposed, becomes this sort of umbrella name for it. But I think all of that research, whether it be mind control or psychic research, would have gone on numerous project names, and I doubt we'll ever be able to get our hands on the documentation to show exactly what was going on, where and when, and who was involved. So,
Horwich used a Faraday cage in some of his research. So can you tell us why you would need a Faraday cage? I know I'm digressing a little bit here, but this is to cut out any radio waves.
Essentially,
So what size was this Faraday cage?
This mind control researcher called James David Manning, and he said in 1951 Horwich received a research grant of close to $100,000 from the US military to build a solid sheet metal Faraday cage to test size subjects worthy of study. And there are several accounts of people. Uri Geller was tested, the infamous alleged psychic spoon bender. Was tested at Lab 9 in the Faraday cage there. Edgar Mitchell, I'll come on to shortly, he said in some variations of the experiments the Faraday cage was used, isolates normal electronic magnetic signals. That research was done at SRI as well, Stanford Research Institute. I'll come to that in a moment as well. So, yeah. Well,
yeah, we'll come on to Mitchell and Geller. All right then, Carl, just hold it there. After the break, we'll find out what Gene Roddenberry wrote in that script about this mysterious Lab 9. Welcome back. I'm talking to Carl James about the creator of Star Trek, Gene Roddenberry, who in the 1970s was asked to write a script about this mysterious group called Lab 9, which you think was a real group, possibly.
I'm pretty certain there is evidence to suggest it was, yeah.
So tell us about that then.
Well, I mean, there's two interesting things about it, really. Is one, that it's running parallel with when he's brought back to effectively create a new Star Trek movie for Paramount. It's running parallel with writing this script for Lab 9. December 19th, 1975, he completes this screenplay for them called The Nine. And there's a little story to it. Basically, he's telling his own experience, metaphorically. He speaks about this character called Jim North, who's effectively Gene Roddenberry. He's the writer and producer of a popular but long cancelled TV science fiction show called Time Zone in it, which I would argue is effectively Star Trek. He's approached by an Englishman representing this group called Second Genesis, which I would argue is Lab 9. And they study psychic healing, out-of-body experiences, telepathy, communications with other beings, that sort of thing. In it, he says that this character does witnesses research at MIT, experiments on theoretical physics and telepathy, and he discovers his own telepathic abilities in the process as well, which leads people to some believe that Roddenberry might have actually looked into that as well. Yeah, but I mean, basically, he sums up, he says, he's like the character, his life was changed forever. Those lovely crazies at a Pennsylvania commune, what they made me believe is far larger, far lovelier. I believe that I know now that all life is one, and that we're all part of this wondrous eternal miracle that we have yet to fully understand. But what's interesting about it is that Whitmore didn't actually like it. I mean, he liked it, but he wanted more of the actual message of that the nine were allegedly conveying, and there wasn't enough of that. But he gave the rewrite to another writer friend of his who was working with him on the new Star Trek film at the time as well, called John Povell, and he wrote the rewrite for this 9 script, and it.
So the original commission, they weren't happy with it.
Yeah.
So they then rewrote it.
Brought in another Star Trek writer, effectively, who was
right.
a close friend of his, working on this new Star Trek film.
Okay.
He wrote it, and it's like basically it was like Galaxy Quest on acid. You know, it was really dark and weird, and and Whitmore didn't like it at all. And that seemingly was where it ended. I mean, certainly after that, there is some evidence that Roddenberry was going to Lab 9, and that at one point, Phyllis Schlemmer's book.
So this film never got made then?
No, the script was written.
Twice?
Yeah, effectively, yeah.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, the details of Roddenberry's version, there's this book called Joel Engel, The Myth and the Man Behind Star Trek. And effectively it lays out what he was writing about in there. But it's very little known. It's not talked about in relationship to Roddenberry a great deal. Certainly not. If you watch any documentaries about Roddenberry's life, it's never mentioned. So.
Right. I don't know if you're aware of NLP, neuro-linguistic programming, where things are often expressed in metaphors. So in Star Trek, there's always some major enemy that's going to attack them and that they have to overcome.
Yeah.
So for me, what psychologically could be being programmed into people is that we need eternal war and eternal conflict. Would you know? That's what Star Trek is selling as a subliminal message.
Yeah. And the alternative message to that as well is a lot of people propose this idea, you know, the whole sort of one world government, the United Nations and that. Certainly if you look at the flag of the United Starfleet and that, it's very similar to the UN flag.
Right.
And people do argue that Roddenberry himself said he modelled the whole Starfleet model, the United Federation planets, on the United Nations model. So
right. So you've
got all that perspective on it as well. So.
Right. It's promoting a new world order or one world government
possibly
ideology.
Yeah. I mean, certainly, I would argue that it promotes every and all agenda with NASA. It's definitely, there's lots of examples of NASA. I mean, I've actually got a quote from DeForest Kelley, who played Dr. Bones McCoy in Star Trek.
So this is Bones from Star Trek.
NASA works with us on our personal appearances. There is always somebody there from NASA with us because they feel that we have lassoed the youth, so to speak, and they're there to sell them on their program.
So much. I'm certain. You look at Nichelle Nichols, who played Lieutenant Uhura in Star Trek. She went to work for NASA, recruiting minorities, ethnic minorities, and women into NASA. And all that.
Right. Now you've mentioned NASA there. I've said in some of my lectures that I believe that NASA is more of a cover organisation for perhaps a secret space program, and that anything that NASA puts out publicly is really just to keep the masses entertained. Rockets were designed over 100 years ago now, and this is what they still put out now with their current supposed space technology. So if they've got their representatives trying to manipulate and keep their eye on Star Trek, which has a massive influence over the masses, I think that's I don't think that they're wanting to genuinely represent space technology. I think they're wanting to represent what they want people to think genuine space technology is, not what the real stuff is. So, So you're going to make a point about NASA and relation to Star Trek.
Yeah. So the evidence is establishing that there's a connection there, and I've showing that there's a connection there between Gene Roddenberry and Lab 9. If you look at what Puharich was doing with his research, we talked about the Faraday cage. This has actually come from NASA astronaut Gordon Cooper. And Puharich studied these children and adults, and he effectively called them space kids, allegedly testing to see what. I mean, I think there's more to it than that. This is what he stated unequivocally, that NASA administrated a mind control program involving school children called Space Kids that was probably run through an MK program. And Cooper was involved with Lab 9, he went there, he saw the experiments at Lab 9, and in his book Leap of Faith, Cooper identified Puharich as the person responsible for the development of NASA's Space Kids project.
Right.
Puharich's assistant Valerie Ranson approached Cooper to develop the project, said they wanted some Cooper's network of connections and things like that. So effectively what you're talking about there is there's this belief that Puharich was involved in mind control research, and Cooper is effectively saying that he was working for NASA on that type of research. So it's an additional spin on what NASA may have been up to at that point in time.
It may be argued that all of this sort of research was 99% mind control, psychotronics technology, and the whole psychic or ESP side of it was just really a cover for it.
Yeah.
And that really it was about how to program someone,
Yeah.
and how to mind control
Yeah.
them, and possibly through psychotronics send messages into their head using technology. Now, that's not to say that I don't think psychic phenomena exists, right? I don't
believe
I don't
it.
anyone to think that with
I do
researchers
believe
such as
it's
Sheldrake.
yeah.
But was it more about mind control than ESP, do you think?
Well, this is the thing. I mean, there are numerous quotes. We've got this young lady called Belita Adair, and she claims that she was traumatised by Paharich's experiments with the Faraday cage. She was studied at Stanford and UCLA by Dr. Thelma Moss in 1975. And this is what she said. It was January, February 1977. She says, I underwent those horrible psychic tests locked in that Faraday cage in Oseni, New York, which is essentially Lab 9, where parapsychologist Puharich conducted hours of research on me, turning off almost all of the air in the cage, moving electrical currents around me. Under his helm, he kept pumping me to obtain the knowledge he wanted, atomic numbers, formulas from the presences that spoke through me. But then you look at somebody like Jack Sarfati, this physicist, and he said he was involved with Lab 9, he was also involved with SRI. He said of Lab 9 and Puharich, I was then 1973 simply a young, inexperienced, naive idiot in a very, very sophisticated and successful covert psychological warfare operation run by the late Brendan O'Regan of the Institute of Noetic Sciences and the late Harold Chipman, who was CIA station chief responsible for all mind control research in the Bay Area in the 70s.
Perhaps we could mention Dr. Edgar Mitchell as well at this point. Do you want to say anything about him?
Because effectively in 1971, Puharich went to Tel Aviv in Israel and he met Uri Geller. Pretty much straight away he said that I've got this good friend Edgar Mitchell, former alleged Apollo astronaut, and he can help with the funding basically, so for test your psychic abilities, bring you back to America. Eventually they settled on Stanford Research Institute. And he did the research there and at Lab 9 as well. And then in the mid-90s, CIA documentation declassified, and effectively the CIA owned up to funding all of the psychic research, including the Geller testing at Stanford Research Institute. Right. And up to that point, the Institute of Noetic Sciences and Mitchell had effectively claimed that they'd funded it.
Right.
And there is this clip. Actually, it was a deleted scene from. It went out as an hour-long documentary called "The Secret Life of Uri Geller," but there was a 90-minute version of it. And in this scene that wasn't in the original broadcast version, Mitchell. I'll just play you the clip. You want to have a listen to what he said.
Okay.
So, how did you first hear of Uri? I was interested in telepathy, psychokinesis, and mental phenomenon, and so forth. An American physician by the name of Andrea Puharich called me after I came back from the moon and said, I found this rather amazing Israeli young man who can do these sorts of things. Would you like to study him? And I was intrigued, and I told him, yes, bring him to the States and let's take a look. And then I set out to arrange the testing that we did with him at Stanford Research Institute, where I met Hal Puthoff and Russell Targ. What I did not know at the time was that the work at SRI was also being funded by our CIA, and only discovered that later. As we finished our work with Uri at SRI, I was called by the head of the CIA and asked to come to Washington and brief him on what we had learned. And that head happened to be George H.W. Bush. He was head of the CIA at that point in time, and it turned out that it was all a part of the same big study. The Russians were studying it, we were studying it, the CIA was studying it, I was studying it, and so it was all a part of the so-called study of parapsychology. I didn't know at that time all work that CIA was involved in.
All right, Carl, well, we'll discuss that clip after this break. Welcome back. I'm talking to Carl James about the CIA's alleged research into mind control, but also ESP and psychic phenomena. And we were discussing Dr. Edgar Mitchell and Uri Geller, because he's alleged to have brought Uri Geller over to the United States.
Puharich and Mitchell did it.
To have to be tested. Now, you want my opinion of Uri Geller? I just think he's a showman. That's my opinion of him. I don't know whether he's got any psychic ability, but I think he could well have been chosen to fool people into thinking that that they were investigating it. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, it could well be that there was a cover. I mean, I'm very much open to this idea of remote viewing and that sort of thing. I think, you know, maybe there is something to it, very much so. But I think it's not so much about what happened with Geller there. It's more about the fact that whatever was going on there, under what sort of cover it ever was being funded by the CIA. September 6, 1995, CIA majority funding of the research was revealed, a public affairs statement. And then they found out additional funding came from US Army Intelligence Security Command, the DIA, the US Air Force, the US Navy, and again NASA. And like in the former clip, you know, you can see Edgar Mitchell saying he'd previously claimed that they'd funded it. But then Mitchell begins reiterating this idea that he was not aware of the CIA involvement until after the testing had been concluded. But there are a couple of points to be made there with this. I mean, they're worth thinking about. There's this quote from the book Phenomenal World by Joan Dark. Basically, she's quoting the research of Ronald M. McRae. She said in his book, Mind Wars, The True Story of Government Research into Military Potential of Psychic Warfare, some interesting things to say about Edgar Mitchell and ions. He writes that George Bush, while director of the CIA, was approached by Mitchell, a personal friend for many years. McRae writes that Bush gave Mitchell permission to organise high-level seminars at the CIA to discuss possible intelligence applications of parapsychology. Despite this support, according to McRae, parapsychology research was never quite institutionalised at the CIA, i.e. it had never had its own department or centralised location, but was pursued as scattered research projects. McRae notes that Mitchell implicated bureaucratic inertia as the problem. Mitchell stated, "We just couldn't get the actors together." That's an interesting word, that is, actors.
Right.
There was always one bureaucratic bottleneck or another. Apparently the problem was solved. The program moved to SRI and the Institute of Neuroscience Sciences and other known CIA cutouts. So effectively he's saying there that Mitchell was involved with the idea beforehand of the CIA. And Mitchell, in fairness, Mitchell has actually owned up to the fact that he debriefed George Bush. But again,
right.
He said, I did it after the Geller testing, you know, after we knew that...
And there are other things about Mitchell which you can, if you watch this particular Richplanet program, the link's on the screen there, you'll find out some things about Dr.
There's Brewster
Edgar
Palmer
Mitchell,
with the End Machine and things like that.
which cast aspersions against what his agendas really are about. And in your notes you say, under hypnotic guidance from Horwich, Geller speaks of a vast entity, stroke consciousness, supercomputer located aboard a spacecraft, blah, blah, blah. Right? Under hypnotic guidance from Horwich. So Uri Geller is speaking under hypnotic guidance from
I mean,
Horwich.
those Horwich's own words in The Sacred Mushroom. Uri, the book Uri.
Right.
He admits that he put... his claim is that he put Geller under hypnotic guidance. But that idea of these machine entities, it crops up so much in the SRI, the Lab 9 scene. You get Jack Sarfati, who talks about receiving a telephone call from this machine entity saying he's on a spaceship coming to the Earth in 1952, 53, something like that. Geller's saying the same thing. And then effectively, Star Trek the Motion Picture is that story. I mean, you could argue that even if he didn't get to write the screenplay for the 9, certainly some of those ideas bled through into Star Trek the Motion Picture, because you have this V'Ger entity who's coming back to Earth, he's a vast super intelligence in the film, you know, and what's seeking out its creator and all this kind of thing. Every version through the late 70s of that film talks about this idea of...
Well, let's just mention Star Trek and Roddenberry, the fact that he lost control, or creative control over it, right? Presumably in the early days he must have had more control over it, because there's the quotation that we can have a look at now.
They're going to do a new one. It'll probably be shot on a high budget TV movie. Then if it has the ability to do it, they'll put it in the theaters or they'll keep it on TV. I'm not going to do it. They will not give me the creative controls I had on the early shows. They will not give me the creative controls I had on the early shows.
Right. So clearly, what he seems to be saying there is that he was the creative force behind Star Trek. But then at some point they said, no, it's too important. Essentially,
it would have been after Star Trek: The Motion Picture, which is why I find it odd that you've got all this Lab 9 stuff connected to, and the message of the 9 connected to the CIA and the military and NASA and all that. I mean, NASA, Richard Hoagland was involved, via NASA, getting the first space shuttle named Enterprise after the Starship Enterprise in the series. So you've got forces pulling at it. And then after Star Trek the Motion Picture is released, it's a huge box office success. I mean, critically maybe not so much. $139 million worldwide, and Paramount just hate it, and they want somebody to blame for it. And Roddenberry effectively is. You get different arguments with this biographies about Roddenberry, but he's just removed from all creative control over Star Trek. It has a little bit when Star Trek: The Next Generation, the television series, comes back in the late 87, but above and beyond like the first year or so of that.
So if I can just ask you, because I don't recall much of the film series of Star Trek, the films, what do you think the agenda that was that they were trying to create in people's minds, and why? What was the what are they selling there? What are they trying to get people to perceive about?
I think it was away from what Star Trek was originally about, and certainly the subsequent television series that are very NASA orientated, that sort of thing. I think essentially it went in a sort of promoting the US military direction. Certainly you've got Harve Bennett, who's heavily involved in those films, and they're much darker, they're much more militaristic. You've got even things like the Masonic thing as well. If you look at the uniforms, the Prussian red and all that, and some of the medallions, the uniforms, they look like the sort of Knights Templar, Knights Malta sort of symbology and all that sort of thing. It's very much away from NASA, and it's very, very much away from what Gene Roddenberry always... He said it was too militaristic. When he came with Star Trek: Next Generation, he wanted to take it back to this idea of NASA, space exploration.
Of Captain Kirk making love to women on strange planets and things like that.
Well, I mean, nothing wrong with that, I suppose.
All right.
But yeah, I mean, in and of itself, it's really strange because even though they wouldn't let him anywhere near it, every subsequent Star Trek film, he pitched a story. He wanted to take credit for taking a story, seemingly. But he pitched the same story every single time.
And this is about Kennedy.
Yeah, this idea that the Enterprise crew travel back in time and get involved in sort of changing World War II, something like that. And effectively, the story ends with Mr. Spock being the man on the grassy knoll firing the...
So I'll just expand on that. So Gene Roddenberry was obsessed with this particular plot line of Star Trek somehow being involved in the Kennedy assassination. So just explain it.
It's like he's post-9...
This has never been made.
No.
He's wanted this to be made.
He proposed it every
for years, right? So
I mean, this is actually...
Just tell us what happens.
Essentially, this is the quote from Harve Bennett, who was controlling so much of the film franchise at that point. He says, no matter what we'd come up with, Gene wouldn't like it, and he'd counter by pitching a story about the crew of the Enterprise coming back to stop Kennedy's assassination. Through my tenure on Star Trek, that story came up as a substitute for whatever we were planning. Star Trek 2, 3, 4, 5, it didn't matter. He pitched it as effectively up to the point where he died. Every single subsequent film, he was obsessed with it. He was, I mean, some people say he had a lack of imagination. He couldn't come up with any other stories. He was determined to, but it just seemed odd that that's the subject matter. And knowing what the people like you and I know about JFK as well. Right.
So do you think he was wanting to reveal something that he knew in a fictional way?
I don't know. I mean, that would just purely conjecture on my part. I mean, it may be possible, but given what he was involved with the CIA and with the 9 and all that, being in that circle of people. I'm not saying he involved the CIA, but he was connected to those people who were involved. He would have been privy to knowledge of some sort, and he was perfectly acceptable to articulate it in his Star Trek material. So maybe.
All right, Carl. Well, we're going to talk more after this. I'm talking to Carl James about Star Trek, and we're trying to really, I guess, in this untangle fact from fiction. That's what it's about, isn't it?
Yeah, it's a very elaborate web of,
and we were talking about psychological operations, and with films such as The War of the Worlds. So just tell us why you think that was a psychological operation.
I mean, in my book, I've noted that it kind of comes out whenever you get these cultural shifts, the 50s War of the Worlds, at the height of the Cold War. You get Steven Spielberg's War of the Worlds, which is very much sort of looking at sort of allegorically looking at 9/11. I mean, you got the little girl saying, "Is it the terrorists? Is it the terrorists?" When these aliens are attacking, all that. It's pushing that sort of that worldview effectively. The official story of. But you go back to the original radio broadcast in 1938 of the War of the Worlds. You've got the involvement of the Radio Research Project, which is funded by the Rockefeller Foundation, and you've got people that effectively studying the effect of that broadcast. It's a very mixed bag on that. Certainly the report only selectively looked at people that reacted in a certain way. How many people did react or not is far more difficult to know, but their report was very biased because they based it on those people who genuinely believed that something was panicking, running in the streets. If there was only a handful of people that did that, they based the report largely on those kind of accounts to make it look as though everybody did react that way. And they were looking at the effects of those kinds of things, whether it be radio or films, could potentially have. And the people that are studying that are people who, psychologists and social engineers employed by the Tavistock Institute, at that time. But it's a tangled web. You've got Robert Wise, who's working with Orson Welles, who was responsible for the 38 broadcast. Robert Wise, who's working with him at that time. Also the director of Star Trek The Motion Picture, which I believe ties into the 9 thing. Also the director of the 1951 film The Day the Earth Stood Still, which there's a lot of evidence out there suggesting that film was part of a psyop to essentially the CIA and the military, to what some people say to acclimatise the public to the ET UFO phenomenon.
Right. So do you think?
So he's employed on multiple levels.
You don't think it's just acclimatising people to the fact that they want to build more weapons in general, and that there may be no ET threat? They're just trying to say, well, there might be one in the future, so we really need to be armed to the hilt. What do you think is the reason that they're making these as psychological operations, if that's what they are? What are they trying to do? Are they genuinely acclimatising people?
I really don't know. I really don't know. I mean, certainly the CIA, if you look at the Robertson panel and things like that, the Durant report and all that, the CIA have muddied it so much. It's difficult to know whether they ever did believe, or they wanted people to believe, or they wanted people not to believe, or you're coming at it from all angles there.
Yeah, I think it goes back to what we said at the beginning, where there's a core truth to all this, to the UFO phenomenon, to out-of-body or otherworldly
which
experiences.
We're not allowed to be sort of privy to. And even if we think we are, you have agencies and individuals who are muddying that, spreading disinformation. So even if we think, we're getting a bit closer to it now, we're starting to get an idea on what's going on, we're really, really not,
Yeah, and to be honest,
you're getting a closer glimpse of it, but not.
I don't go to the cinema. I can't even remember the last time I was in the cinema or watched a film on TV. It's I guess because I'm aware that it's been made by people with an agenda, for nefarious agendas, I would suggest.
But that's the interesting thing, because I have been a lifelong science fiction fan. I really have always enjoyed it. I'm an avid science fiction fan. And so much so that I would buy a lot of biographies of famous science fiction writers and directors and that, and read up. And as I started my journey into sort of alternative knowledge, I started to recognise certain names, and I remembered these names and thinking, I'm sure I read that in this biography about Gene Roddenberry, for example, or something like that. That person is into some really, really strange stuff here. Why is Gene Roddenberry, as that example, but it applies to a lot of other people as well. So I'm connecting the dots in, and so it's changing my perspective on science fiction then. It's not something then that you can just kick back, have your popcorn and have a drink and just enjoy it. There's something being subtly, and you have to ask the question. I mean, it doesn't apply to just Star Wars, but Star Trek, but you look at Star Wars as well. These are huge franchises, and people are almost mesmerised by them. They're the fandom, even people that aren't dedicated fans, they are multi-billion-dollar, industries.
So if we can come a little bit more up to date, I saw that there was a new film about Mars. Now, as I said, I tend not to have any interest. I prefer facts and evidence.
Yeah, well, I do, but
it tends to be the best way to find the truth, rather than watching a film. But what's going on in this latest Mars film? It's about some guy who gets stranded and he has to grow his own food on Mars.
Yeah, Matt Damon. Yeah,
right.
Yeah.
So have you got any comment on that?
Well, I know that NASA are heavily involved in it, and they tend to do that quite a bit. You know, as we've already shown with Star Trek. What agenda, I don't know, but I find it very, very telling that you recently have had Matt Damon on videos on YouTube where he's talking about the Occupy movement and the 1% and things like that, and he's talking about the New World Order, and he's talking about, I'm paraphrasing him here, but organised revolution and all this kind of thing, and fighting back against it. I mean, somebody who's got that, a load of money that he's got, you know, why isn't he digging into his pocket and paying for the 1%, you know, 99%, you know what I mean? It's double standards, and also, if you look at him himself and you look at the connections he's got, I can't remember them off the top of my head, but this circle of people that, if you look at genealogy, there's numerous genealogy websites, you can see that they're all effectively related to each other. Looking at Brad Pitt, his wife Angelina Jolie, who's involved with like Council on Foreign Relations and all that, and United Nations, and these are people that are going off and doing charitable work for the United Nations in Africa, and some people believe that some of it's involved with gun running and all this drug dealing, all sorts of things. It's crazy stuff, you know. So it's
they've got to have their controlled opposition, of course, to soak up that interest. I mean, we have Charlotte Church and Russell Brand in the UK, don't we? Charlotte Church, who, if you watch her Leveson inquiry testimony, it's just drools over Rupert Murdoch's wealth, and then suddenly she's there with her placard. Come on, it's hilarious. All right, so I've digressed a bit.
I mean, there is one very, very important point to note with that film. It's directed by Ridley Scott. Ridley Scott has got huge connections to the US military and the CIA. His brother Tony Scott directed Top Gun, which was effectively a huge propaganda film for the US Air Force and that sort of thing. Was about to direct a sequel to it just before he died under very, very suspicious circumstances. I've documented a lot of the articles that were published at the time of his death. It just does not make any sense at all what actually... the story is so contradictory as to whether this cancer that he had. And Ridley Scott himself as well has directed a promotional film for the charity Common Purpose that Brian Gerrish has talked about a lot. So he's heavily associated with what I generally sort of loosely call the agenda players. You know, so.
We've mentioned Mars because I've done talks about the images from the alleged Mars rovers, and I'm still not fully decided, but I think there's very strong evidence that certainly the Mars rovers are in the Canadian Arctic somewhere. They're not on Mars. If you want to see evidence for that claim, watch this talk from this link on the screen there. And so, but I guess this current Mars film was probably in production some years ago, I would imagine.
I think the novel that the film is based on is fairly recent. It's only a couple of years old, so and I think it's quite sort of close to the novel. But it's interesting that you should mention that, and you can tie it back to Star Trek for a moment as well, because I think Andrew Johnson talked about this briefly when he was talking about, I think it was that show. You look at, say, for example, Robert Picardo, who played the holographic Doctor on Star Trek Voyager, involved with the Planetary Society, very good friends with Bill Nye, the science guy, or Science Shill as I call him, and they're heavily promoting the NASA, the Mars rovers and all this kind of thing.
It's a pleasure for me to meet people who work in NASA, particularly in Jet Propulsion Laboratory, because that's where I'm closest to, and I've visited there many times, who grew up watching Star Trek.
They've got this group called the Red Rovers, these kids from America that are just sort of heavily promoting this idea, principally the idea that Mars is red, you know, and that sort of thing, but it goes beyond that as well.
Yeah, well, it's Mars is red. Well, the Earth is blue, and then it's made to look red.
Maybe it's the other way around.
Yeah. So there's this blurring of fact and fiction.
Yeah.
So you used to sit down and watch television, and you would know, well, this is like something factual. It's a documentary, and this is now make believe. It's just all one big bowl of soup, isn't it?
Yeah. And it'd be worth mentioning as well, Richard Hoagland. Again, with his really good friends with Gene Roddenberry, and this is a really, really interesting quote, actually. It's from an article he wrote himself. He said, in the early 1980s, after the initial work done at Stanford Research Institute by the independent Mars investigation, I think this was Mission Enterprise, which was looking at things like the artifacts on the Mars face and things like that. So Hoagland had approached Gene Roddenberry and others in an attempt to secure funding to conduct further research. After several briefings and serious consideration, Roddenberry declined. What was peculiar about this was not so much that a man with such intense curiosity about the universe and man's place in it would decline, but rather the reasons he cited for it. And he said, "I'm sorry, Dick," he said at the time, "but that would really make things complicated for me." Just what or who those complications were, he did not reveal.
Right. All right. Well, on that note, thanks for coming in again today, Carl. Been fascinating listening to you. And just remind viewers the name of your book and where they can get it from.
Yeah, my book is Science Fiction and the Hidden Global Agenda. I am currently working on an updated version of it, which hopefully will be along soon. www.thetruthseekersguide.blogspot.com. And there's a large banner across the top there where you can get the book from.
All right. Well, as usual, believe none of what you hear and only half of what you see. I'm Richard E. Hall. Good night.